There exists a fair few facts of life: needing to eat, needing to sleep, needing to obey the laws of physics, and having the inability to divide 0 by 0. But another fact of life is that, simply put, people need to get places, whether for work, leisure, supplies, or otherwise, and this might involve a walk down the street, or it may involve going further afield where walking isn't really practical. Over the course of our existence as a species, we've created many solutions to this problem. Ever since we discovered horses until about a century ago, they were the primary method of transportation, although some cultures used other animals such as elephants and camels, and I'm sure there are other examples. Humanity's mastery of animal husbandry has gotten us a long way, quite literally so. But then, in the early 20th century, there was a big change. Rail, as a way of transporting both people and goods, was starting to mature and become widely adopted. But along with the commodifying of oil, the titans of industry at the time had an idea. What if we took the locomotive off the track and allowed it to travel basically everywhere? Starting with Mercedes-Benz, and popularised by the likes of Ford, the automobile entered the scene. But there was a small, or rather not so small, problem with this new invention. You see, back in the early 1900s and the 1910s, towns and cities were developed very differently from today. The streets were, put simply, for people. They were a place for people to commune, to conduct commerce, for children to play in, for festivities, etc. While many older population hubs stood their ground, pun kinda intended, and continued to function in this way, even though they would have to adapt later on, newer cities in the 20th century started to become more and more car-centric. They started to be designed around automobiles. Fast forward to today, and it's obvious where this trajectory has taken us. The automobile is now, globally, the primary mode of transportation. Despite only the wealthiest being able to afford it at the time, for the first half of the 20th century, the car seemed like an attractive option. It isn't bound to a specific path, it isn't temperamental, neither makes a big mess everywhere, at least most of the time. Because more people wanted them, a lot of this demand attributed to advertising and marketing by the way, production started to ramp up. More manufacturers emerged, and cars, vans, etc. became cheaper and easier to obtain. However, today, a car-centric society presents a list of problems, some of which are starting to materialise as we speak. These issues range from ecological to economic to social problems, which I will elaborate on. Let's start with the lowest hanging fruit, shall we? Cars are simply pretty bad environmentally. Even though now electric vehicles are catching on, the vast majority of automobiles today rely on combustion engines. These can take a fuel such as petrol, diesel, biodiesel or ethanol and combust them in a precise pattern in order to generate kinetic energy which moves the vehicle in question. Chemically, these fuels are what's known as organic molecules. They are molecules containing carbon-hydrogen bonds, and when these are combusted within an engine, they are oxidized to CO2. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It is a greenhouse gas because it absorbs light very effectively in the infrared spectrum. There are many other greenhouse gases out there, but CO2 is the important one. Now, it might seem like electric vehicles would be an apt solution to this problem. However, they have their own environmental concerns, such as sands, recycling, and things like refining brine. A lot of large-scale mining is needed in order to extract the lithium needed for electric vehicle batteries. It's likely that sodium-ion tech will alleviate this problem somewhat. However, because they are still automobiles, and because, well, nothing lasts forever, they'll still end up producing gigantic amounts of waste which will need to be managed in some way. Not to mention that within the contemporary context, it's likely that the energy needed to charge up these vehicles is going to come from carbon-producing sources. To prove that electric vehicles aren't the panacea that big tech touts them to be, let's look at the perfect scenario, where electric vehicles are produced using energy that comes from renewable means, and then at the end of their life, these vehicles are then recycled in their entirety. So you need to spend energy to produce these electric cars, of which you need to spend energy to extract the resources to produce them, and on top of that you need to spend time, energy and labour to build additional infrastructure, like charging stations for these electric vehicles, and then when these vehicles eventually break, they will need to be meticulously recycled, which consumes yet more time, work and energy. Sure, these vehicles could be repaired, but if we're thinking about this from a perfectly circular perspective, those faulty parts will still need to be recycled in some way. Or we could look to alternatives, which I'll get to later on. There is another huge impact that the automobile has on the world, both environmentally and socially. Something that's not so obvious, a bit more insidious in fact. And that is how the car, or the automobile in general, has effectively changed the way we think about designing cities and the way we develop them further. The logic goes that if people have cars, then they can travel greater distances to go shopping, to go to work and other stuff. With the way zoning laws are set up in a fair few countries, homes and amenities, homes and workplaces, homes and vital services are further apart from each other. This way of doing things sort of works if you have a car. But if you are a member of the rest of society who are unable to drive or simply can't afford a car, then this kind of urban planning really doesn't work in your favour. Not to mention that greater distance between places means more fuel spent, which has obvious environmental ramifications. But that's not all. Because of the nature of the automobile, being it can go anywhere at a great distance, among other factors at play, developers of cities are incentivized to continuously build outward. This is known as urban sprawl. This is bad environmentally because of the waste, deforestation, developing over green spaces, etc. But it's also bad socially because it leads to the centralization of populations, and thus less populous communities are left behind. Let's talk about some other problems with car-centric infrastructure, shall we? Although we've come a long way in terms of road and car safety over the years, it's still not nearly as safe as the alternatives. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 10 adolescent deaths are attributed to road accidents, making it the leading cause of death for that age group. Although the trend is downward, these things do tend to improve as time goes on. There were nearly 120,000 UK road casualties alone for the year 2021. In contrast, fatalities from rail accidents are exceptionally rare. Here's yet another point I wanted to make. Even within the context of capitalism, automobile-based infrastructure is just bad economically. I mean, it's good for big and medium-sized businesses who run large logistical operations that span across the globe and they need to get things to different places and such. But as a consequence of this, small businesses on the high street, small stores, things like that, they're suffering. Why? Because if you're driving along in a car, you're much more likely to be concentrating on your driving rather than looking around you and taking interest in your surroundings. Vice versa if you're walking. And because most people drive cars, small businesses like that aren't getting as much foot traffic, and so they're not attracting as many patrons. Not to mention that buying and maintaining a car is a huge cost for a lot of people, and so they actually have less money to spend at these small businesses. Now, in this video, we are talking about transportation in general, not just cars. I bashed automobiles quite a lot in this video. But when even the likes of cars can't take you far enough, what forms of transportation do people usually use? For international and intercontinental travel, we have two main options currently. Those are boats and planes. Air travel is, put simply, fast. It is basically what makes intercontinental travel feasible for most people, but some even use it for domestic and international travel as well. It's no secret that air travel is a big contributor to global warming, not to mention the obvious safety risks. No, not them kind of safety risks. I'm talking about something more along the lines of these. But anyway, What is the solution? What is the future of modern transportation? What could we do in terms of transportation that lowers our ecological impact while also improving our lives? Well, it's kind of complicated. We can split transport into two main categories: transport of people and freight, which is the transport of goods. Firstly, let's start with people. Public transport is something that has received appreciable investment from some countries, while in others it has been sadly neglected. Nevertheless, the world could do much better in the way of mass transit. There is so much public transport that you could bake into a large city, such as trains, underground subways, buses, trams, etc. In the past half-century or so, magnetic levitation has proved itself as a viable technology and has been implemented in multiple countries. And because maglevs can approach speeds not much slower than that of aeroplanes, it could prove to be a viable solution for fast international and even transcontinental travel. But public transport is only part of the story. I am yet to talk about cycling and the modern microtransit revolution. During 2020, as a knock-on effect of the pandemic, we saw a cycling boom, and cycling has continued to grow more popular since then. But in order for cycling to become a truly viable form of transportation for most people, we need the cycling infrastructure in addition to public transport in order for it to become more accessible and viable for people. Many cities in the Netherlands are famous for their cyclability, and this has a lot to do with how the cities are designed. Are there dedicated lanes or cycle paths? Are there places to park bikes? Are there bike ranks where people can hire bikes to use without actually owning a bike? But more importantly, are places easy to get to in the first place? The key to not having just a cyclable city, but also a walkable city as well, is having a high density of buildings and keeping streets as walkable paths, cycle paths, or areas of mixed use. In a city where buildings are closer together, it's easier to get from A to B due to the reduced distance. This also makes cities much more walkable, but also, if we preserve more space for walking and cycling, then the town or a city as a whole will be overall more accessible for people who walk, and also cycling will be much safer and less intimidating for people, since in this case, cyclists would not have to compete with cars like they do in many cases today. Barcelona has taken many strides in this regard with the creation of what is known as superblocks. These are city blocks where cars can still access them, but there is no intuitive route into a superblock via a car. There are many videos on YouTube that go into more detail on this topic, and I encourage you to take a look. But something that has also contributed to the emergent cycling boom we've seen recently, even before COVID, was the emergence of e-bikes or e-cycles. These electrically motorized vehicles assist cycling, making it easier for people to use them than a conventional cycle. This means that even if you're not particularly athletic or even particularly fit, you can still use an e-cycle to get to places. There are even people who have took up e-cycles as a replacement for their car, partially due to long-term savings. Actually, going on from e-bikes, there is something that is one step closer to a car that might be attractive for some people, and that is the velomobile. Velomobile, you might ask? What's a velomobile? In plain English, a velomobile is essentially a bike car. It's a pedalled and or electrically motorized vehicle that's essentially an e-bike or an e-trike or even an e-quad, except it has actual bodywork, and that means that is more resistant to things like rain and is also more practical for, say, storing things. Now, not many people know these things exist. I've seen a couple in my lifetime, but I definitely think they have potential to be more widely adopted. But in order for, say, e-bikes to become widespread, there needs to be infrastructure there for that, such as charging stations and places to park them. But as I said before, the best way to get people to adopt cycling is to design cities and towns around cycling itself, much like how in the 1920s new built cities were designed around automobiles. While it would be much easier to incorporate this kind of infrastructure and design in newly built towns and cities, existing urban environments could be retrofitted with cycling infrastructure without too much difficulty. There's some ideas about transporting people, but what about transporting goods? What about freight? This is something that's a little more challenging, and it's something that I think requires a rethink of how we do logistics. Today, most goods are transported via road. However, in a post-automobile society, this obviously wouldn't be possible, at least in the way we know it. You see, most food cultivation and manufacturing is done in centralized economic centers where things are typically produced. Bananas from Brazil, computer chips from China, that sort of thing. Because a lot of one thing is produced in a specific location in the world, and a lot of people around the world want to use that thing, there needs to be a lot of logistics involved, especially long-haul logistics. While regional and intercontinental shipping will still happen in the future, something that we can do to mitigate the amount of miles a particular good travels is to decentralize and localize production. We now have technologies and production methods such as additive manufacturing, automated CNC devices, intensive vertical farming and such, and the general miniaturization of processes that were previously confined to an industrial setting that allow things like batch production to be much more efficient and economically viable, while centralized production at large economic scales has the advantage of massive output in a small amount of time. Localized batch production makes up for that by a reduction in energy and transport cost. In addition, decentralized production is much more controllable and is able to cater to demand much more accurately, thus reducing waste. Whereas with centralized production, there is a lot more guesswork in terms of how much of the product will actually be used. And this is part of the inherent resource efficiency of decentralized, localized production. And as I have alluded to, it means that products that are locally produced need to travel less and so require less freight. In said future, I can easily imagine that for many goods, any freight required could be fulfilled through things like freight trains or even electric microtransit vehicles and other forms of non-automobile transit. My central point then, while it might seem radical, with a little creativity and ingenuity, a car-free future is indeed possible. But not just that, it is also desirable because it would mean less emissions, happier, healthier cities, and safer, vibrant, more pleasant communities. I hope you've enjoyed listening to my thoughts on this. If you like what you see here and you want more from me, then don't forget to subscribe and check on me once in a while. Sharing this video and others helps gain exposure for the channel and helps raise awareness of issues such as transportation, among others. Thank you for your attention, take care, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.